All right, so you've been digging into uh, strategies for businesses, trying to break into emerging markets.
Yeah,
And you've got this great article here, a Harvard Business Review article called Strategies That Fit Emerging Markets
right.
by Tarun Khanna, Krishna Palapu, and Jan Sinha.
Yep.
We are going to extract the gold from this article today so you can not only, impress everyone at your next meeting, but also, maybe more importantly, steer clear of some common pitfalls.
Yeah, it's classic for a reason. These insights are as relevant today as they were when it was first published.
Exactly. And so the article kicks off with this concept of institutional voids.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever heard this before?
I have, yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful, but it really gets to the heart of, what makes emerging markets so different.
Right, yeah.
And basically it means that a lot of the fundamental, sort of structures that we take for granted in developed economies,
Yeah.
like reliable market data or
Yeah.
skilled intermediaries or, a strong legal system, just don't exist, or they're really underdeveloped in these markets.
Yeah, and it's not just about physical infrastructure, it's like
Mhm.
the whole ecosystem that supports, business transactions.
Right.
Like imagine trying to secure a loan without a reliable credit rating system or
Mm.
trying to, enforce a contract when the courts are backlogged for years.
Yeah.
Those are the kinds of challenges that, companies are facing in these markets.
It's like trying to, build a house without a foundation.
Exactly.
You're constantly having to improvise and adapt.
Yeah.
And speaking of adaptation, that kind of leads us to our next point,
Mm-hmm.
which is why these traditional market entry strategies, they just backfire in these environments so often.
Right.
All those global rankings, we always see like GDP growth,
Yeah.
ease of doing business.
Yeah.
The article really argues that relying solely on those can be really dangerous.
Yeah, those rankings are useful for a broad overview, but they don't really capture the nuances of each market's, unique institutional context.
Right.
It's kind of like using a map to navigate a city without knowing the local traffic patterns or the street closures.
Exactly.
You might end up, stuck in a dead end.
So it's not enough to just look at that big macroeconomic picture.
Right.
You really got to get down to the street level and understand the local terrain.
Yeah.
And the article gives a really compelling example here to illustrate this point.
Okay.
They compare Brazil, Russia, India, and China.
Uh-huh.
All four of those countries score relatively similarly on some of those popular indices.
Right.
But on the ground, the reality is just so dramatically different.
Totally. Yeah.
Like take retail, for instance.
Okay.
Global chains like Walmart.
Mm.
They've thrived in China.
Yeah.
But they just really struggled to gain a foothold in India,
Mm.
where these small independent shops still dominate.
And that's a perfect example of how, those institutional voids can shape, entire industries.
Yeah.
In India, the lack of efficient supply chains and distribution networks
Right.
makes it, incredibly difficult for large retailers to really compete on price with, those local shops.
Right.
It's a reminder that what works in one emerging market may not work in another, even if they look, similar on paper.
So if we can't rely on those global rankings,
Yeah.
what tools do we have to navigate this tricky terrain?
Right.
Well, the article provides a really handy framework called the 5 Contexts Framework.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not about, memorizing a list of factors here.
Right.
It's about asking the right questions
Yep.
to get a more, granular understanding of a specific market.
I like to think of it as a checklist to guide your due diligence, not just on a potential partner or an acquisition, but, on the entire business environment of a country.
Right.
It forces you to go beyond the surface and, really understand what the rules of the game are.
Okay, so let's walk through these 5 contexts. And for each one, I'd love to hear, an example or an anecdote from you that just brings it to life. So the first context is political and social systems.
Mm-hmm.
This is all about understanding the power dynamics,
Yeah.
the level of corruption, the social norms, the values that just shape the business landscape.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
This is where, things can get really tricky
Right.
for companies that are used to operating in, these more transparent and
Yeah.
predictable environments.
Right.
A great example of this is, the concept of guangxi in China, which refers to, the importance of personal relationships and connections.
Right.
In business companies that, try to do business in China without understanding the nuances of guangxi often find themselves at a significant disadvantage.
It's not just knowing the right people. It's about understanding the unwritten rules of engagement.
Exactly.
Right. Okay, so the second context is openness. And this refers to how open a country is to foreign investment and trade.
Right. And this one is a bit more straightforward,
Mhm.
but, it's still crucial.
Yeah.
Some countries are very, welcoming to foreign companies. Hmm.
While others are more protectionist and have, strict regulations in place.
Right.
A good example of this is, the automotive industry in India,
Hmm.
which for years was heavily protected by, high tariffs
Right.
and import restrictions.
Right.
And this made it very difficult for foreign car makers to compete in the Indian market. And it also, stifled innovation within the domestic industry.
So even if a market seems really attractive, in terms of growth potential, you have to consider that level of openness.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, the third context is product markets.
Mm-hmm.
And this is all about understanding consumer preferences,
Yeah.
distribution channels,
Right.
and the competitive landscape.
This is where things can get really fascinating. I think,
Okay.
in emerging markets, you often see a much wider range of consumer segments than you do in developed economies.
Right.
You might have a small but growing middle class that's, eager to embrace Western-style products and brands.
While, the majority of the population is still very price sensitive and traditional in their consumption habits.
Right.
So companies need to be aware of these different segments and really tailor their products and marketing accordingly.
It's almost like you have multiple markets within one country,
Exactly.
each with its own dynamics.
Yeah.
Okay, the fourth context is labor markets.
Mm-hmm.
And this one focuses on, the availability of skilled labor.
Yep.
Wage levels and labor regulations.
This is a major consideration for companies that are looking to, set up manufacturing operations in these markets.
Right.
In some countries like China, you have a vast pool of low-cost labor,
Mm-hmm.
but the, quality of skills may vary widely.
Right.
In other countries like India, you might have a higher skilled workforce, but labor laws can be very complex and challenging to navigate.
So you have to weigh the trade-offs
Mhm.
between cost and quality,
Mm-hmm.
and also factor in that, regulatory environment.
Yeah.
And finally, the fifth context is capital markets, which looks at, the availability
Right on.
of financing, the development of financial institutions, and just the ease of making investments.
Yeah, and this can be a major bottleneck for businesses in emerging markets.
Right.
In many cases, access to capital is limited.
Right.
Interest rates are high,
Hmm.
and, there's a lack of transparency in the financial system.
Right.
This can make it difficult for companies to secure funding for expansion
Right.
or even just to manage their cash flow effectively.
Right.
A good example of this is, the venture capital landscape in Southeast Asia.
Hmm.
While there's been a surge in investment activity in recent years, it's still, relatively underdeveloped compared to markets like the US or China.
Right.
So this can make it challenging for, startups in the region to access the funding they need to really scale their businesses.
So once you've kind of mapped the landscape using this 5 context framework,
Right.
and you've identified those institutional voids, what do you do about them?
That's the big question.
Yeah, the article gives us 3 main strategic options.
Okay.
And I think we have just enough time to cover the first one today.
Let's do it.
So most common approach,
Yeah.
and often the most practical, is to adapt your business model to the local context.
Adapt. Yeah.
So you're not abandoning your core value proposition,
Right.
but you're being flexible.
Mm-hmm.
And you're finding creative ways to deliver it in this challenging environment.
Yeah.
And the article uses a great example here. They talk about Dill's entry into China.
Okay.
They were so famous for their direct sales model,
Mm-hmm.
which worked, brilliantly in the U.S.
Right.
But in China, consumers just weren't comfortable buying computers online.
Interesting.
So Dell had to adapt.
Yeah.
They kept their core value proposition, which was affordable, customizable computers,
Right.
but they ditched that direct model
Okay.
and started working through distributors.
Interesting.
It was a big shift for them,
Yeah.
but it allowed them to succeed in a market that was so different from what they were used to.
That's a great example of how, adaptation can be, the key to success in these markets.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the local constraints and finding, innovative solutions that meet the needs of your customers.
Right.
But, you're still staying true to your brand.
It's like being a chef who can adapt a recipe to use local ingredients, but without, sacrificing the flavor of the dish.
Exactly.
Okay, we're going to leave it there for now, but we've just scratched the surface of these strategic options.
Right.
When we come back in part 2, we'll delve into the other 2 options, changing the context, and believe it or not, staying away completely.
Okay.
But until then, I want you to think about how you might adapt your approach to a specific emerging market. maybe using Dell as inspiration.
Sounds good.
Welcome back to our deep dive into strategies that fit emerging markets.
Yeah.
So we've been unpacking this whole concept of institutional voids.
Right.
And how they can really trick up companies,
Yeah.
who don't do their homework. And we started looking at, how businesses can adapt their models to succeed like Dell did in China.
Right.
But adapting is just one option, ready to explore the others.
Absolutely. Let's move on to the second strategic option that the article presents, which is changing the context. Now, this might sound a little audacious, even a little controversial, but hear me out.
I'm intrigued. So this is where we move beyond simply playing the game to actually trying to reshape the rules.
Right, exactly.
But how is that even possible?
Well, think about it. Some companies have such enormous influence, not just, economic, but also political and social, that their actions can actually trigger positive change. In the broader business environment, they're not, imposing their will, but they're working within existing structures to create a more favorable climate for themselves and for others.
So it's not about brute force, it's about strategic leverage. The article gives this fascinating example, the impact of satellite TV on India.
Right.
Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, sure. So, back in the 1990s, India had a very limited television market, mostly state-controlled.
Right.
And when satellite TV came in, it wasn't just about entertainment. It exposed people to new ideas, products, lifestyles. It created a demand for consumer goods and services that hadn't really existed before.
So it wasn't just a new industry, it was a catalyst for broader societal change.
Yeah, exactly.
That's pretty remarkable.
And it put pressure on the government to, open up the market, to reform regulations. This wasn't, the sole intention of the satellite TV companies, of course.
Right.
But it was a powerful side effect of their entry into the market.
This kind of raises the question, when companies change the context, are they always doing it with the best intentions?
That's a good question.
Is there a risk of exploitation or unintended consequences?
That's a question worth pondering. There's certainly a debate about the ethical implications of companies having this level of influence, especially in countries with, weaker institutions. But I think the key takeaway here is that, businesses operating in these markets aren't just passive players. They can be agents of change, for better or for worse.
It's a lot to consider. Okay, so we've got adaptation working within the existing constraints, and now we've got changing the context. This much bolder, but potentially, more impactful strategy.
Right.
What's the third option the article presents?
Sometimes the most strategic move is the simplest one. Staying away.
Really? You're saying that some markets are just not worth the headache?
Exactly. It might seem counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Especially when, everyone is talking about the growth potential of emerging markets.
Right.
But, the article emphasizes that not every market is right for every business.
Right.
Sometimes the institutional voids are so deep, the risks are so high, that it's just not worth trying to force a fit.
So the article uses Home Depot as an example.
Right.
Their entire business model revolves around DIY culture, reliable logistics, easy access to financing. These things just weren't present in some of the emerging markets they initially tried to enter.
Right.
They learned the hard way that sometimes retreat is the better part of valor.
Yeah. It's a tough decision, especially for companies that are, under pressure to expand globally. But, recognizing when a market just isn't a good fit can save you a lot of time, money, and frustration in the long run.
It's like knowing when to fold your hand in a poker game.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got our three main options. Adapt, change the context, or stay away.
Right.
Now, the article concludes with this really intriguing concept, treating markets as a system.
Yes.
What does that mean exactly?
So this is where we move beyond looking at each emerging market, in isolation. And we start thinking about them as interconnected parts of a global strategy.
So it's not just about conquering one country at a time. It's about seeing the bigger picture.
That's it.
The article uses GE as a prime example. So they're sourcing components from China, doing software development in India, and leveraging their expertise in the U.S. for core innovation.
Right.
It's about recognizing that each market has unique strengths.
Yeah.
And then creating a system that optimizes those strengths across your global operations.
Exactly. And it's not just about cost arbitrage.
Right.
Although that's certainly a factor.
Yeah.
It's also about accessing talent. tapping into innovation that's happening in different parts of the world and building a more, agile and responsive organization.
So instead of trying to replicate your entire business model in every country, you're kind of cherry picking the best aspects of each location and weaving them together into a more efficient and resilient whole.
I like that analogy.
This sounds like a brilliant strategy for a company like GE with its vast resources and global reach, right? But how can smaller companies who might not have those advantages still benefit from this systems thinking approach?
That's a great question. I think it comes down to, strategic partnerships and collaboration.
Right.
Even smaller companies can build networks and alliances that allow them to tap into, the strengths of different markets.
So it's like a collective bargaining approach to globalization.
Exactly. Imagine, a cluster of smaller businesses, each specializing in a particular area of expertise, combining their strength to compete on a global stage.
Right.
It might be sourcing raw materials from one country, manufacturing in another, doing their marketing and design in a third.
That's a really powerful idea.
Yeah.
It democratizes access to global markets.
Right.
And it allows smaller players to punch above their weight.
And it's becoming, increasingly viable.
Right.
In a world where, digital connectivity and remote work are becoming the norm.
Okay, so let's step back for a moment and connect all of this back to you, our listener.
Yeah.
So we've covered a lot of ground today, from institutional voids to these 3 strategic options. And this fascinating idea of treating markets as a system.
Right.
What are the key takeaways that you should be walking away with?
The biggest takeaway I'd say is that emerging markets are full of opportunity, but they require a different playbook.
Right.
So don't rely on those, superficial rankings.
Yeah.
Dive deeper into the institutional context using that 5 contexts framework.
It's like we said at the beginning, this isn't about sounding smart in a meeting. It's about making smart decisions.
Exactly. Understand the unique challenges, consider your strategic options, adapt, change the context, or stay away.
Right.
And then think about, how you can leverage the strengths of multiple markets to create a more resilient and competitive business.
And who knows, maybe you can even be part of shaping those markets for the better.
Right.
Like those satellite TV companies in India.
Absolutely. The article focuses mainly on, these big multinational corporations.
Right.
But these concepts are relevant for businesses of all sizes. In fact, smaller companies may even have an advantage in terms of agility and adaptability.
So now that we've explored these strategies, I'm curious to hear what you, our listener, think about this.
Yeah.
Have you encountered any of these challenges in your own work?
Right.
Have you seen any examples of companies successfully navigating these institutional voids, or even changing the context? We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Absolutely. Let's continue this conversation online. Share your experiences and insights. We're all learning from each other on this journey.
As we've been going through this article, I keep thinking about how much the world has changed, since it was published back in 2005.
Oh, yeah.
The emerging markets landscape. It's even more dynamic and complex now.
Well, the article itself acknowledges that, these markets are constantly evolving. What might have been, a significant institutional void back then could be a thriving sector today.
For example, the article talks about, consumer credit being really underdeveloped in a lot of these markets. But now with things like mobile payments and fintech, access to credit has just exploded in places like India and Kenya.
Right.
It totally changes the game for businesses.
Absolutely. It highlights the importance of, staying informed and being adaptable. You can't just rely on outdated assumptions.
Yeah.
You really need to keep your finger on the pulse of these markets.
It also makes me think about the role of technology.
Yeah.
Like this article, it predates the smartphone revolution.
Right.
The explosion of social media, the rise of e-commerce giants like Alibaba and Flipkart. How do you think these technological advancements have impacted the strategies, that businesses are using in these markets?
Well, technology has been a game changer, no doubt.
Right.
On one hand, it's helped to bridge some of those institutional voids. E-commerce platforms have made it easier for businesses to reach consumers in remote areas, bypassing traditional distribution channels.
And social media has become such an important tool for market research
Totally.
and understanding consumer preferences.
Exactly. But, technology has also introduced new challenges.
Right.
The rapid pace of innovation means companies need to be even more agile.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have, the increasing importance of data privacy and cybersecurity.
Yeah.
It adds another layer of complexity.
It's like the game board keeps changing,
Right.
and the players need to constantly, adapt their strategies.
That's why having, a framework like those 5 contexts
Right.
is so crucial and helps you navigate these complex landscapes
Right.
and make, more informed decisions.
So what's next for emerging markets?
Hmm.
What trends should business leaders be paying attention to?
One really exciting trend is the rise of a new generation of consumers in these markets.
Mm-hmm.
They're young,
Yeah.
they're tech savvy,
Mm-hmm.
and increasingly aspirational.
Okay.
They're driving demand for, new products and services.
Right.
And they're not afraid to embrace, innovation.
That's a huge opportunity for companies who are willing to, understand their needs
Absolutely.
and cater to their preferences.
And it's not just about consumer markets either.
Right.
We're also seeing, a surge in entrepreneurship
Yeah.
and innovation within a lot of these emerging markets themselves.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that the future of business isn't just about going global. It's about
Yeah.
recognizing that, the best ideas and talent can come from anywhere.
Exactly. We need to shift our mindset,
Yeah.
from conquering these markets to really collaborating with them
Right.
and learning from them.
Well, I think we've successfully extracted the wisdom from this article.
I think so.
Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listener, remember, when it comes to emerging markets, the only constant is change.
Yeah.
Stay curious, stay informed,
Stay adaptable.
and until next time, happy diving.